Then we go to Isaiah, the 9th chapter. There is the promise there of a Messianic king. The text is in what would be called prophetic perfect, so it's spoken of as if it already happened. Ki yelad yulad lanu ben nitan lanu. A child has been born to us, a son has been given to us, as if it had already happened. Isaiah chapter 9. But then it describes this one. Let's scroll down to verse 6. It says this about this son. For a child is born, to us a son is given. So again, in Hebrew, it's prophetic perfect. It's as if it already happened. The prophet's looking at it as if it already happened. The government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Pele Yoetzel Gibor Aviad Sar Shalom. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now, there's a lot of debate about the right translation here. El Gibor, Mighty God, occurs again in Isaiah 10:21, speaking of Hashem, the Lord himself. But most scholars, most commentators believe that these would be throne names of the child, descriptive of the child. And one of them is Mighty God. And there is a passage in the Talmud, as well as Ibn Ezra, one of the top 3 rabbinic commentaries from the 11th century. He says the names are the names of the child, but then tries to interpret them differently. So who is this child, this Messianic child, who has divine names spoken of him? Let's go over to Psalm 45. Psalm 45 is a psalm about a royal wedding, about a Davidic wedding. And what you have to understand is that the promises to David find their fulfillment in the Messiah. In other words, the many things that God promised David were not done in his lifetime, but find their fulfillment in the greater David, the Messiah himself. So let's skip down to verse 6. Psalm 45, and it says, Kisacha Elohim la'olam va'ed. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. Well, that's certainly words of praise to the Lord. I remember asking a Hebrew teacher in college who was a rabbi, could you translate that for me? It's one verse down in Hebrew. And he read it and he said, yes, praise is to the Almighty. I said, could you read the rest of the psalm? His face literally turned red. Because it's so clear, just if you're reading it in itself, Kisacha Elohim la'olam va'ed, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. That's what it says. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. You've loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. What? Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you? You just got called God. The Davidic king, and here is a type of Messiah, is called Divine One, God. That's how he's addressed. To try to read it, Kisacha Elohim la'olam va'ed means your divine throne is forever and ever. It's really a forced reading. You would never think that way. So let's step back. Number one, we see potential references to God speaking of himself in the plural. Let us, our image, our likeness. Not definitive, but in harmony with God's complex unity. But we can't make a proof on that. We see God manifesting himself, coming in our midst in a physical way. Abraham literally washes his feet, feeds him and the 2 angels with him. Moses sees him in a burning bush. All these things crystal clear in terms of when you just read it through naturally without trying to make it fit a theology. So the eternal God, who elsewhere no one can see his face and live, like Exodus 33, that's what God tells Moses, no one can see my face and live. Yet he comes in the midst of his people and he reveals himself in flesh and blood. And then we see the Messianic king being directly identified with God.